Eleanor and Daniel had been looking for a home to escape the bustle of the city. The search had been exhausting, weeks of endless listings that either didn't fit their budget or weren't what they had in mind. They wanted something special, something unique. Then they stumbled upon it, a sprawling, decayed mansion nestled in the woods on the outskirts of town. It was unlike anything they'd seen before, an enormous, 3-story Victorian with a wraparound porch, turrets, and towering gables that gave it an almost Gothic air. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years, but the charm of its faded grandeur spoke to them immediately. Eleanor's eyes lit up the moment they stepped through the creaky front door. She ran her hand along the dusty banister of the grand staircase that spiraled upward, envisioning what it would look like after some love and restoration. "This place has character," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous foyer. "I can't believe the price is so low." Daniel was more practical. "Yeah, but look at the state of it. It's going to cost us a fortune to fix." But Eleanor had already made up her mind. "Imagine what we could do with this place, Danny. It's a fixer-upper, but it's perfect. And there's so much space." Despite his reservations, Daniel agreed. There was something magnetic about the house, something that made it feel like theirs from the moment they set foot inside. Within a week, they had signed the papers and officially moved in. The townspeople had been less enthusiastic about their decision. "You're living in that place?" one of the older shopkeepers had asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "It's beautiful," Eleanor had replied with a smile. "We're going to restore it. No one else lived there for decades," the woman said, her voice low and serious. "Not since the Hargrove family. They say it's cursed." Eleanor had left off the comment, but the strange looks and muttered warnings from the locals followed them for the rest of the day. Daniel had been more uneasy about it, but Eleanor dismissed it as small-town superstition. Every old house had a ghost story, right? It was all part of the charm. The first few nights in the mansion were relatively peaceful, though there was a persistent feeling of being watched, like the house itself was observing them. The air inside seemed heavier than usual, thick with age and secrets. Daniel complained about strange noises at night, soft footsteps, distant whispers, but Eleanor chalked it up to the house settling. After all, it had been empty for who knew how long. One evening, while unpacking in the basement, Daniel noticed something odd. At the far end of the room, behind a pile of old crates, a section of the wall didn't match the rest. The stone was newer, like it had been hastily bricked up long after the house was built. "What do you think this is?" Daniel asked, running his hand over the uneven surface. "It doesn't look like part of the original foundation." Eleanor, ever the adventurer, grabbed a crowbar from the tool chest. "Let us find out." They worked together to pry away the stones. It took longer than they expected. Whoever had sealed it had done so with a sense of urgency, but finally, the last brick tumbled away, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. A cold draft emanated from the opening, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decay. The light from their flashlight barely penetrated the blackness. "Do you think this was some kind of cellar?" Daniel asked, peering into the tunnel. Eleanor shook her head. "It's not on the blueprints." Without another word, she stepped inside, ducking to avoid the low ceiling. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls narrowing the further they went. The air was damp and oppressive, the weight of the earth pressing in on them from all sides. Daniel followed closely behind, his nerves jangling as they moved deeper into the unknown. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, winding and twisting beneath the mansion like a forgotten artery. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the end, a crude wooden door, swollen with age and decay. Its surface scratched and scarred as though something had desperately tried to claw its way out. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the rusty latch. "This doesn't feel right," she whispered. Daniel, despite the knot forming in his stomach, urged her on. "We've come this far. Might as well see what's inside." With a sharp creak, the door swung open, revealing a small, decrepit shack. It was barely larger than a garden shed, its walls rotting and weather-beaten. The scent of mildew and something far worse clung to the air. The shack seemed out of place, like it had been forgotten by time. They stepped inside cautiously, their flashlight beams cutting through the dust-filled air. Strange symbols were carved into the wooden beams, their jagged lines unfamiliar and unsettling. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor was silent, her eyes fixed on the center of the room, where a large stone altar stood. The altar was stained dark with old blood, and scattered around it were bones, small, delicate, and unmistakably human. "We need to leave," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't be here." Daniel's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the shack. The light sputtered and died, plunging them into darkness. "Damn it," Daniel muttered, fumbling with the flashlight. "I just changed the batteries." But before they could move, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The air grew thick and suffocating, and a low hum began to resonate through the shack. It sounded like chanting, a chorus of disembodied voices growing louder by the second. Eleanor's heart raced as she reached for Daniel's arm, but he wasn't beside her. "Daniel," her voice trembled. No response. "Daniel," she called again, louder this time, panic rising in her chest. But all she could hear was the chanting, the ancient, guttural words filling the room. Suddenly, the symbols on the walls began to glow a sickly green, pulsing in rhythm with the voices. The temperature dropped sharply, and Eleanor could see her breath in the air. She turned in circles, desperate to find Daniel, but the shack seemed to be shifting around her, the walls closing in. Then she saw a figure standing in the corner, hunched and twisted, its skin mottled and gray, like rotting flesh stretched over brittle bones. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, burning with an unnatural fire. "Daniel," Eleanor screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the chanting. The creature smiled, revealing a mouth full of jagged, blackened teeth. It took a slow, deliberate step toward her, and then another. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She backed away, tripping over the altar, her hands scraping against the stone. Her skin burned where it touched the ancient surface, as if the altar itself was alive with some dark power. The creature lunged at her. Eleanor bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She slammed into it, her hands clawing at the wooden boards, but it wouldn't budge. She could feel the thing closing in on her, its breath hot against her neck. Then she heard Daniel's voice. It was faint, distant, like it was coming from far away, but unmistakable. "Eleanor, over here." She spun around, desperate, but Daniel was nowhere to be seen. "Where are you?" "Here," he called again, his voice echoing from the tunnel behind her. Without thinking, she threw herself back into the tunnel, crawling on her hands and knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the creature's snarls grew louder, its claws scraping against the stone walls. Eleanor ran through the tunnel, her lungs burning, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She didn't know how long she had been running, minutes, hours, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her. Finally, she reached the basement. The moment she stumbled through the opening, the tunnel sealed itself shut behind her with a deafening crash, the stones falling into place as though they had never been moved. Gasping for air, Eleanor collapsed onto the cold floor, her body trembling. "Daniel," she whispered, but the basement was silent.